Welcome to Muddy Boots Outdoors, and today we're going to go over a terrarium build. This is the before and now the after. So as we can see here, we started out with an empty tank, and I went ahead and took some measurements so that way I could find out what size of insulation board I needed to cut. So here is me going ahead and taking my measurements. I'm going to go ahead and mark everything out. Now this is just expanded foam insulation board that you can get at any hardware store. As I make my cuts, always make sure to measure twice and cut once. But what's nice about this type of board is that it cuts fairly easy, it's incredibly cheap, and if you mess it up, so what? You messed it up. So this was fitting the insulation board into the tank and making sure that everything was snug, that I didn't have to glue it in place. So some things I probably would have done differently is I actually would have used silicone on the inside of the tank, a dark colored, or you can use white, either or, because as of right now my tanks are purple. However, you can always go with that look too. Just make sure that the insulation board, when you make your cut, that the solid side with no print will be on the outside and then the print will be on the inside. And once again, this is me cutting the sides. Now all this stuff is fairly easy. It can be cut with a razor blade, no big deal, and here it is fitting them in to make sure everything's snug. Now on the sides, I wanted to make sure that they pressed against the back so that way I didn't have to worry about it falling forward from the weight. Now it would be on to the bottom of the false floor. So this is just your basic egg crate or your like drop ceiling fluorescent lighting cover. It's very thin, very cheap. It can be cut with just some pair of wire snips. Just go ahead and make sure you cut it. Now some things I probably would have done differently is I would have gotten some cocoa bark mat and glued that to the front and sides after gluing down the, or zip tying down the weed barrier. So this is me making the feet for the false floor. And my assistant making sure I'm doing a good job of that. To hold all this together, it was just very short, I think they were 3-inch zip ties. It held together incredibly fine, and if you do over tighten them, they will kind of break free, but as long as you keep them on there held pretty tight, it holds the shape. This is just reinforcing the floor, so now I'm going to go ahead and do a dry fit. Now what I should have done here is I actually should have did this in 2 pieces. It would have been a lot easier since I had that metal bar in there. And on top of it, what I didn't compensate for is when I cut my insulation board, it was cut to go all the way to the bottom, and so I had to recut the insulation board so that way it could sit on top of the false floor. It also makes it incredibly and easily removable too, which is nice. So this is me after everything has been recut. I am refitting to make sure everything fits in place. Nice and snug. So this is how everything looks dry fitted in before any substrate or accessories are added. Now I went ahead and cut some holes where I was going to put some potted plants in, so that way they could sit down in the water as such, and then the roots could be constantly moist and stay wet. I also went ahead, and this is just basic weed fabric, however it does allow water through it. I just pull it over, and I will zip tie it into place also. Here I'm just trimming to length, and so where it will fit properly. This doesn't necessarily need to be incredibly tight, but it does need to be a little bit loose depending on if you cut holes in there for your potted plants. That way they can sink down for your plants. So this is where the cocoa fiber bark would have came in handy had I made the false floor a little bit shorter. So this is me working on the back side here. So what I did here is I got just regular garden cups, and I went ahead and taped them down before foaming them in place. To get them to kind of sit at the angles I wanted, I had to cut a hole out of the insulation foam there, and what I will do when I go ahead and foam them in place is I will tape a piece of paper to the back of it to keep the foam flat so it doesn't explode out all over the place. And that's just basic paper from a notepad, and I'm going to tape it in place, and it will make everything nice and flat. So this is go ahead and foaming everything in place. Now this is just regular grate stuff. One thing I probably would have done differently, and I do it later on, but I probably would have used the actual pond foam. It's black, and it is a little bit more expensive, but the black will kind of hide any irregularities, along with a dark colored silicone. And then that mixed with your substrate, soil substrate, whatever you're going to use for your backing, should hide pretty much any imperfections, anything that might not have stuck. If it did stick, maybe it didn't stick well. So this is foaming everything in place, and I foam around the cups, and I have laid out some cocoa bark on there too, just some added texture. And I do foam these cups into place. Now later on I will actually remove the cup, so that way I can pack soil in there, and it will hold its shape. Now to get the silicone to stick, you actually have to cut all of the smooth, shiny, expanded foam off and kind of expose the airiness of it, so the silicone can actually adhere to it. If you do not, it will not stick. And that is one thing that I also did to the insulation foam, is the plastic covering that was on it. I also removed that too, so that way the silicone could also stick to it. It is a very long and tedious process. Take your time, and a long-bladed razor knife works great for that. It's flexible. You can kind of get it into the small spaces, and if you need to make large cuts, you can do that. But here I'm just shaping the overall general consistency of what I want and trying to remove any shininess. So this was getting everything in the place, and to get the wood to stick, I just used some actually super weld super glue. It's industrial strength. About 5 seconds of pressure, and whatever you have glued is there. It will not come off. After everything was set in place, I went ahead and foamed around it too, just to kind of give it some more texture and to kind of hide any of the purple background. This was part of the waterfall kit that I was designing. So in that very back corner at the top end of the screen, there's actually a pump with a waterfall that will be installed, and that tree branch that I'm holding there is where the water will actually come out of. One thing that's nice about the expanded foam, when you find a spot that you really like something in, you can just kind of take a stick and jam it in. Or you can cut it and kind of shape what you want with it. If you need it to lay a little flatter or maybe be angled a certain way. There's some better lighting of what the finished product will look like. So as we look here, we can see there's a lot going on, many plants, many trees coming out. And this is how to get some of these trees that maybe won't glue into the sides. You can just go ahead and cut your foam, or if they're pointy enough, jam them through the foam. So this is a side shot of the tank on its side. And here we'll be starting the silicone and substrate. The substrate used is some cocoa fiber with cocoa bark. The cocoa bark just kind of gives some added texture. The cocoa fiber will kind of make it a brown color and kind of look very earthy. Around the potted plants in some other areas, there will be sphagnum moss super glued in. When you do that with the sphagnum moss, just make sure you kind of use a lot of sphagnum and make a big glob of the glue. A lot of it will come off in your fingers, but what you do get stuck on there will stay. What I'm doing here is I'm scoring the background with a razor blade, and what that will do is it will allow the silicone to penetrate into it, giving a better adhesion, and it'll be less likely to pool or flake off once it dries. Nothing needs to be perfect, just make some light scrapes in there, and you'll just kind of break up the smoothness of the background. Now, what you're not seeing is I'm actually going through the entire tank and doing that. And that's just saving me time in the long run. I want to say all told this took about a week from start to finish. A lot of this was right off the hip in design and planning. There's a lot of things I could have done better. A lot of things that I wouldn't have done that the next time I do this I will do differently. However, what I did do does work. It is still working and flourishing. So here I am with silicone. Now once at the time I could not find a different color silicone, so I used white. Now this is just regular latex silicone. Nothing special. I do believe this is the anti-mold. Well, as you can see, it is tub and tile. I've had no issues with this. I've actually have mushrooms growing in the terrarium now. One thing that I would have done differently here is I would have used a brown. The brown, it makes it a lot easier to hide stuff. So I'm using this paintbrush to apply everything. It kind of gives it a more smoother texture, but I also make sure that what I apply I'm covering. And this is something that you want to do in small time frames. So just one little section at a time, because the silicone will start to dry rather quickly. I think this had a 30-minute window of trying to get everything applied, and realistically it had about anywhere from like maybe a 10 to 15-minute window. So it's best to try to get everything covered as quickly as possible with your silicone, so that way you can put your substrate into it. And the substrate, it would be fairly easy. You're going to sprinkle it on and press it in. Just make sure you give it a pretty good hard press, and make sure that you have a lot on you. You will have a lot wasted, so excess is very good in this matter. Trying to make sure that everything was covered with silicone. And now the brush does work, and it is fairly consistent and thorough. However, later on I just ended up using my hands and with a pair of gloves on. I was able to do it a lot faster, and on top of it, brushes cost money. I was trying to be cost effective, and in about 30 minutes anyways, the brush is ruined. So, and I didn't have anything to try to clean the latex off. Alright, so here's some of the cocoa bark I put in there, and it's just a light sprinkle, and it just kind of gives some more texturing. Instead of it being just one flat, it kind of a little bumpy. And no really particular area. And now here's the cocoa fiber, and this is actually a mix of cocoa fiber and some soil. And as you can see, you press it on there. Always make sure you put the cocoa bark on first, and then you can press your cocoa fiber in around everything. And it will, when you vacuum off the excess or blow the excess off, it will give a lot better of a texturing and more realistic background. On top of it, it also makes it very easy for anything you have in your terrarium, whether it be microfauna or actual animals, that they can actually climb on that, and it helps with grip. So this is the continuing, and it looks like from here, this is where I switched from the white silicone to a brown silicone, which is something that I would recommend overall, just because if you don't press enough on, and if you press too much silicone in, the silicone will show through the cocoa fiber, to whereas if you use like a brown or even a black along with the expanding pond foam, anything that may press through or show will not actually be seen because of it having a darker background. I will say this though, in the same sense of that, when you use a white silicone and you press it in, it actually kind of gives the appearance of a almost like maybe a certain type of lichen, or similar to like a little bit of a mold kind of coming through the background, which kind of almost makes it look even a little bit more realistic than just everything being various shades of brown. And here once again is I used a paintbrush to go ahead and kind of put everything on there really well. And I want to say here shortly the paintbrush will be in the trash and I will just be using my hands. And as if you attached everything securely, you really do not have to be gentle. Just get as much on there as you can, as quickly as you can. And if you do need to kind of go over some more spots, once everything's dry, just put a little dab, kind of smear it around, and then, you know, put some more substrate in there for your background, and it'll look good. And in this sense, more is better. Do not go skimp with your silicone. If you need to wait a little time to maybe save up a few more bucks to buy a couple bottles, do it. And all told, I want to say I went through, I think, anywhere from 6 to 8 bottles of silicone. And I'll let you know the total price of everything at the end of this. I did actually find all of my receipts for all. That's the only reason why that I know. And the animals that I did add into this also. Now, I did get lucky, and I will say that some of my cost was offset. It would have been a lot higher. However, I already had some substrate with microfauna already in it, so that actually did save some cost. So here I am adding the cocoa fiber and the cocoa bark, just kind of doing small areas at a time, so that way nothing dries on me before I can get anything in there. And in these really hard and, you know, small spaces, and then this is one of the things I would have done better, is I wouldn't have actually put a planter down there in that corner. Doing what I did actually consumed a lot of space, and how it does look good, it was almost too much. I really should have probably backed the planters down to maybe only like 2 or 3, and maybe only in one corner, and had more wood coming out of the other, and kind of given it a more forest floor instead of like upper canopy. I guess it kind of does look more like a forest floor, kind of a mix. I know for the next one that I do, it'll be a lot more planned out, and it is actually a larger tank. This is a 30-gallon breeder, and I picked up a 75-gallon breeder. Or no, not a breeder, just a 75-gallon high. Well, and so that was another thing. So this one was actually, it's kind of short, so that's why I picked up something taller. So I had more to work with. But here's more silicone. And like I said, just work in small areas at a time. You don't want to try to do the whole thing at once and rush it. Just go slow, and you'll be okay. And then that way you can kind of see if you've missed anything. And here I'm going to go ahead and reposition the camera for you to give you a better angle of what I'm doing. So yep, you just want to smear it in there and spread it around and try to make sure you cover all areas very consistently, and make sure you got a nice good thick layer on there, and try to make sure you actually don't miss anything. Once again, just adding the coca bark. And there's really no rhyme or reason how I add it. It's just kind of sprinkled in. Some places a little heavier, some places a little light. Every now and again I might actually just kind of picked up like a half handful and actually just thrown it and seen where it hit, and then that's where I let it lay. And then putting the coca fiber on and just giving it a good press in the tight areas. Now some of this I'm just going to tamp down in. Now also in my coca fiber mix there were pieces of moss mixed in there too, so it'll have a little bit of a moss coming out of it in certain areas. Now in some of these areas, as you can see, I'm adding some more sphagnum moss in there. It doesn't really matter how thick or how much you put on or use, just as long as you get a good consistent layer and get it kind of good and pressed into the silicone. Whatever isn't into the silicone, when you lift the tank up, it'll all fall out and it can easily be vacuumed up. But you just really want to make sure that you get a good pressing, and that way you'll have a nice consistent background. So now this is where, as we can see, I've glued in some more sphagnum moss on that planter there. Now the cord that we're looking at is actually to the water pump. And what I want to do is I'm going to hide that cord, and in doing so I made some rope vine. Very simple to make. I do believe I have a video up, and here is just some industrial strength super glue. That I'm going to glue this rope down, and I'm going to leave enough space so that cord can be kind of tucked behind it to where it hides it. Now this is another thing that I would have changed. I would have made my pump a lot more accessible. In this corner there's a lot of things going on in this corner, and it makes it very hard to access it, to service it, or even maintain it. And so that's one thing I would have changed, is I probably would have made that cord come straight up and hit it through the background, using either a paper towel roll or just giving me enough space to do so. However, like I said, this was it was planned, but when I did it, I was like, oh, I'm going to add this, and I was like, oh, I didn't really think about how I was going to add it. I just did it. And however, I did make it work. It does work, and it does hide the cord, and it does kind of give like some more added texture into the background. So then you just kind of hold it there, depending on how much glue you put on. I think I might have had to glue this one a couple times in this one spot, but just give it a good press, and voila, there it is. And I just kind of snaked this around to match the same layout as the actual plug-in cord had. So super glue is your friend here. I think in total I only had like a couple bottles of super glue, and that it was actually more than enough. So here I've added some more vines. I've super glued them in, as we can see. Or I'm getting, oh, that's right, I just kind of got the vines to where I wanted them to go and how I wanted them to look. And once again, this is more of rope. This is just regular rope that's been covered in silicone and then covered with cocoa fiber. I will have a video on that, short one on how to do it. Very simple, and this actually is very cost effective. I want to say I spent $5 for almost 20 foot of rope, a bottle of silicone, and then I had excess cocoa fiber anyways. It took, I did it in a day, and I made enough vine to do this tank and probably 3 more. And on top of it, I had varying thicknesses of rope, so I was able to split them to make it look like vines coming off that had spun and that were going into separate plants. Once again, once you find what looks best or what you think will be the greatest aspect of it, go ahead and super glue it in place. And I would recommend using an industrial strength super glue. Any hardware store is going to have it. Your typical Loctite or just regular polyacrylic super glue, it doesn't dry as quick, to whereas an industrial strength one will dry pretty much in seconds, and it holds. So one thing I also did do here is those are actually fake plants. It came off of a mass hanging plant, and I just kind of snipped individual leaves off, and I did glue them into the vine to make it look like those were actual plants of the vine. Now I did that as a kind of a secondary oopsie type of deal. So just in case if all your plants die and you need some green in there to break things up, I mix fake and real plants together. I've always kind of done that. And just because sometimes plants, they live for a while and then they die. Well, you got to get a new plant, you got to get it started. So it kind of just kind of break things up. And maybe if you don't want real plants because you don't like the hassle type, so to speak, of it, using fake plants in this type of manner look fairly real and they look natural. And a lot of that can just be maybe searching online and looking at various pictures to kind of see what's what. Now, one thing I did want to do is I did vary the amount of leaves, the length, and how many would be on a vine. I didn't want an overabundance, I didn't want an underabundance, I just wanted what I felt was just enough. And some of that too can be to where you are actually using it to break up where you glued it. Or maybe if some of your expanding foam got on the wood or some of your other substrate and it's really hard to clean off, you can use some of those fake plants to glue them in to hide that imperfection. And it also gives a breakup to the background itself. It adds what I would call texture. As we can see with the sphagnum moss, that was all just super glued in place, so just make sure that you'll put your glue down and then a big handful of it. And there are some more of the leaves I put in. And they're varying degrees of colors of different greens and yellows, and it comes from light green and dark green and light yellow to dark yellow. But it just kind of break that up just a little bit. So I would tell you the names of these plants, but I can't remember it because I did this a while ago, and as I said, it was a well thought out, hurried rush. So, however, as you can see, this is where I'm putting them, and everything has worked out so far. They're all doing very well. One thing like I said, I would have changed about this is I would have used a larger tank. So here's some more air rope, and as you can see, I put in some air plants. Now, one of them has moved because actually the spot I had it in caused it to get too wet, and it caused the bottom to rot out on it, which was unfortunate. Luckily, it was a fairly cheap one, so it was easily replaced and moved, and I didn't really care for the spot that it was in. So, and just adding the vines as I'm doing is kind of makes it look as if the vines have grown in and choked a lot of the trees out there and kind of busted them off, and that's why looks as if the vine is coming out of the ground. I also wanted to provide areas that any fauna that might be placed in there, they would have the ability, if they wanted to or chose to, that they could climb or warm themselves or just kind of ambush prey. So as we can see, there is water down in that bowl there, and that was where I was testing the pump. Once again, super glue is very handy in these types of things when you want it to stick to the side. You can also use it to hide imperfections. I want to say some of my silicone and substrate mix did not stick very well, or I missed it, and I was actually able to hide all of that with the vine. And I cannot stress the importance enough of wearing either latex or nitrile gloves. I prefer nitrile gloves, though I am a chemist, so I don't really care for latex at all. Gloves in any type of this manner makes everything so much easier, and if you do get anything on your hands, it's just ripping the glove off and throwing it away. The gloves are super cheap, and I probably went through almost a box, if not more than half a box, just in this endeavor. That's the glue that I went ahead and used. It was just JB Weld, the Super Weld. That is industrial strength super glue, and it works wonders. It was much better than the Loctite or Gorilla Glue that I used. So here's some of the varying thicknesses of vines. So I actually bought 4 types of rope, each with a different thickness, and some of them were very thick, and I was able to actually unravel them to make it look like vines that have come apart. But one thing I probably would have changed is that big Mopani trunk right there in the middle. I would have removed it. I would have kept a more open middle viewing area. I kept that in there because I thought the fauna would use it to bask on, and they have not. Also, anytime that I need to do any maintenance inside the terrarium, I have to remove that anyway, so it has actually become more of a hindrance than an aesthetic. But as we can see, I'm super gluing the smaller vine around the larger one, looking as if it had, choked out some plants, and had maybe the larger one had died and the smaller one had came in to replace it. It also gives a little bit more strength to the vine in case any fauna wants to climb on it, or if something's kind of maybe falling and I couldn't see, this would actually keep it pinned there. So even at this point, I have already gotten all the plants in place, as we can see from the right corner all the way to the left corner. And actually the purple plant in the far back there has done so well that I've actually been clipping it now and placing sprigs of it throughout the terrarium there, where the substrate is actually very thick, so it can potentially root in. So this is Gorilla Glue that I'm about to use, and it's the gel. They do want you to shake it. I did not care for the Gorilla Glue, either the gel or the regular super glue of it. It took a little bit longer to hold, and it did not hold as well. But here is one of the instances where I kind of made an error, and I put so much of this glue down it formed a big white spot. And so I was actually able to hide it with some of the fake leaves. I glued a fake leaves in there, and that kind of did everything up. So there is everything finished. I have an LED light on the back end there, and we can see that the pump's running. Now, I didn't have this totally full of water, so that's why the pump is not gushing out. It also needed to be adjusted a little bit more, but that is the finished end of it. And as we can see, I have some succulents, I've got some grasses, I've got some other succulents in the back, some air plants. To me, it kind of comes off as maybe like a forest floor collapsed canopy type of deal, but the fauna that is already in there are roly-polies or isopods. So, and I'm also adding, there is one leopard gecko, there's also an Chinese cave gecko, an African fat tail, and a western banded gecko. I have also, since adding them, I've added another leopard gecko that was a Tremper albino. So in total, so the African fat tail was 50, the leopard gecko was 40. The Chinese cave gecko and the western banded gecko were both 100 apiece. So minus them, I spent roughly about $750 on all tank and supplies. Now, lighting I already had, so that saved some money, but everything else I did not have. So, and that's just for substrate, decorations, plants. That was, I did not include silicone. If you didn't have a silicone gun, you'd have to include that. So, I mean, in total, for this whole setup, was about $1,000. So, but I bought everything new. Nothing was secondhand. And so, I mean, you can save some money by buying stuff secondhand. If you have things on, you know, laying around that you might want to repurpose, you could do that also. I did not. I had not had any terrarium or really any reptile stuff like this for probably almost a decade. So this was me kind of, what can I do in a week with unlimited funds, but something basic and simple, but look very complicated. And this is what I did. Now, at the end of this, I do know that I can do better. I do have, like I said, a 75-gallon tank that I potentially will work on. I'm probably going to sell this setup first, or I might sell this one after I get the other one set up, because I want to give the fauna more room to move around. And as an update, I do not run that pump anymore. I did, and I liked it. However, that these, like I said, the setup needed improvements, and how I did everything, I can't improve it. So I kind of give it a monsoon rain to water everything, maybe once or twice a month, maybe a week or two, and it has all worked out. But here is everything close up. I hope you guys liked and enjoyed the video. Please do like and subscribe. This is the Muddy Boots Outdoors channel. I have plenty of other channels if you like to see fishing, you like to see any outdoor activities. Right now it's the winter, so I tried to bring the outdoors inside as best I can. Hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned. I'll have more videos coming up, and let me know what you think.